The Emperor Babur was sixth in descent from Tamerlane, who died in 1405. Tamerlane's conquests were worldwide, but they never formed a homogeneous empire. Even in his lifetime, he parceled them out to sons and grandsons. Half a century later, Transoxiana was divided into many independent kingdoms, each governed by a descendant of the great conqueror. When Babur was born, 1482, an uncle was king of Samarkand and Bokhara, another uncle ruled Badakhshan, another was king of Kabul, a relative was the powerful king of Khorasan. These princes were of the family of Tamerlane, as was Babur's father, Sultan Omar Sheikh Mirza, who was the king of Fergana. Two of Babur's maternal uncles, descendants of Genghis Khan, ruled the Mughal tribes to the west and north of Fergana, and two of their sisters had married the kings of Samarkand and Badakhshan. The third sister was Babur's mother, wife of the king of Fergana. The capitals of their countries were cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Herat. Tamerlane's grandson, Ulugh Beg, built at Samarkand the chief astronomical observatory of the world a century and a half before Tycho Brahe, 1576, erected Uraniborg in Denmark. The town was filled with noble buildings, mosques, tombs, and colleges. Its walls were 5 miles in circumference. Note: Paris was walled in 1358, so Froissart tells us. End note. Its streets were paved. The streets of Paris were not paved till the time of Henri IV, and running water was distributed in pipes. Its markets overflowed with fruits. Its cooks and bakers were noted for their skill. Its colleges were full of learned men, poets. Note: in Samarkand, the odes of Bayasangar Mirza are so popular that there is not a house in which a copy of them may not be found. Babur's Memoirs. End note. And doctors of the law. The observatory counted more than 100 observers and calculators in its corps of astronomers. The products of China, of India, and of Persia flowed to the bazaars. Bokhara has always been the home of learning. Herat was at that time the most magnificent and refined city of the world. Note: Babur spent 20 days in visiting its various palaces, towers, mosques, gardens, colleges, and gives a list of more than 50 such sites. End note. The court was splendid, polite, intelligent, and liberal. Poetry, history, philosophy, science, and the arts of painting and music were cultivated by noblemen and scholars alike. Babur himself was a poet of no mean rank. The religion was that of Islam, and the sect the orthodox Sunni, but the practice was less precise than in Arabia. Wine was drunk, poetry was prized, artists were encouraged. The mother language of Babur was Turki, of which the Turkish of Constantinople is a dialect. Arabic was the language of science and of theology. Persian was the accepted literary language, though Babur's verses are in Turki as well. We possess Babur's memoirs in the original Turki and in Persian translations also. In what follows, the extracts will be taken from Erskine's translation. Note: Memoirs of Babur, Emperor of Hindustan, written by himself and translated by Leyden and Erskine, etc., London, 1826, 4to. End note. Which preserves their direct and manly charm. To understand them, the foregoing slight introduction is necessary. A connected sketch of Babur's life and a brief history of his conquests can be found in The Mughal Emperors of Hindustan. Note: by Edward S. Holden, New York, 1895, 8vo, illustrated. End note. We are here more especially concerned with his literary work. To comprehend it, something of his history and surroundings must be known. From Babur's Memoirs. In the month of Ramzan, in the year 899, A.D. 1494, and in the 12th year of my age, I became king of Fergana. The country of Fergana is situated in the fifth climate, on the extreme boundary of the habitable world. On the east it has Kashgar, on the west Samarcand, on the south the hill country, on the north. In former times there were cities, yet at the present time, in consequence of the incursions of the Uzbeks, no population remains. Fergana is a country of small extent, abounding in grain and fruits. The revenues may suffice, without oppressing the country, to maintain 3,000 or 4,000 troops. My father, Omer Sheikh Mirza, was of low stature, had a short bushy beard, brownish hair, and was very corpulent. As for his opinions and habits, he was of the sect of Hanifa, and strict in his belief. He never neglected the 5 regular and stated prayers. He read elegantly, and he was particularly fond of reading the Shahnameh. Note: the Book of Kings, by the Persian poet Ferdowsi. End note. Though he had a turn for poetry, he did not cultivate it. He was so strictly just that when the caravan from China had once reached the hill country to the east of Ardijan, and the snow fell so deep as to bury it, so that of the whole only 2 persons escaped, he no sooner received information of the occurrence than he dispatched overseers to take charge of all the property, and he placed it under guard and preserved it untouched, till in the course of 1 or 2 years, the heirs coming from Khorasan, he delivered back the goods safe into their hands. His generosity was large, and so was his whole soul. He was of an excellent temper, affable, eloquent, and sweet in his conversation, yet brave withal, and manly. The early portion of Babur's Memoirs is given to portraits of the officers of his court and country. A few of these may be quoted. Khosru Shah, though a Turk, applied his attention to the mode of raising his revenues, and he spent them liberally. At the death of Sultan Mahmud Mirza, he reached the highest pitch of greatness, and his retainers rose to the number of 20,000. Though he prayed regularly and abstained from forbidden foods, yet he was black-hearted and vicious, of mean understanding and slender talents, faithless and a traitor. For the sake of the short and fleeting pomp of this vain world, he put out the eyes of one and murdered another of the sons of the benefactor in whose service he had been, and by whom he had been protected, rendering himself accursed of God, abhorred of men, and worthy of execration and shame till the day of final retribution. These crimes he perpetrated merely to secure the enjoyment of some poor worldly vanities, yet with all the power of his many and populous territories, in spite of his magazines of warlike stores, he had not the spirit to face a barnyard chicken. He will often be mentioned in these memoirs. Ali Shir Beg was celebrated for the elegance of his manners, and this elegance and polish were ascribed to the conscious pride of high fortune, but this was not the case, they were natural to him. Indeed, Ali Shir Beg was an incomparable person. From the time that poetry was first written in the Turki language, no man has written so much and so well. He has also left excellent pieces of music. They are excellent both as to the airs themselves and as to the preludes. There is not upon record in history any man who was a greater patron and protector of men of talent than he. He had no son nor daughter, nor wife nor family. He passed through the world single and unencumbered. Another poet was Shekem Beg. He composed a sort of verses in which both the words and the sense are terrifying and correspond with each other. The following is one of his couplets. During my sorrows of the night, the whirlpool of my sighs bears the firmament from its place. The dragons of the inundations of my tears bear down the 4 quarters of the habitable world. It is well known that, on one occasion, having repeated these verses to Mulana Abdal Rahman Jami, the mullah said, "Are you repeating poetry, or are you terrifying folks?" A good many men who wrote verses happened to be present. During the party, the following verse of Muhammad Salik was repeated. What can one do to regulate his thoughts with a mistress possessed of every blandishment? Where you are, how is it possible for our thoughts to wander to another? It was agreed that every one should make an extempore couplet to the same rhyme and measure. Every one accordingly repeated his verse. As we had been very merry, I repeated the following extempore satirical verses. What can one do with a drunken sot like you? What can be done with one foolish as a she-ass? Before this, whatever had come into my head, good or bad, I had always committed it to writing. On the present occasion, when I had composed these lines, my mind led me to reflections, and my heart was struck with regret that a tongue which could repeat the sublimest productions should bestow any trouble on such unworthy verses. That it was melancholy that a heart elevated to nobler conceptions should submit to occupy itself with these meaner and despicable fancies. From that time forward I religiously abstained from satirical poetry. I had not then formed my resolution, nor considered how objectionable the practice was. Transactions of the year 904, A.D. 1498 to 99. Having failed in repeated expeditions against Samarcand and Ardijan, I once more returned to Khojend. Khojend is but a small place, and it is difficult for one to support 200 retainers in it. How then could a young man ambitious of empire set himself down contentedly in so insignificant a place? As soon as I received advice that the garrison of Ardijan had declared for me, I made no delay, and thus, by the grace of the Most High, I recovered my paternal kingdom, of which I had been deprived nearly 2 years. An order was issued that such as had accompanied me in my campaigns might resume possession of whatever part of their property they recognized. Although the order seemed reasonable and just in itself, yet it was issued with too much precipitation. It was a senseless thing to exasperate so many men with arms in their hands. In war and in affairs of state, though things may appear just and reasonable at first sight, no matter ought to be finally decided without being well weighed and considered in 100 different lights. From my issuing this single order without sufficient foresight, what commotions and mutinies arose! This inconsiderate order of mine was in reality the ultimate cause of my being a second time expelled from Ardijan. Babur's next campaign was most arduous, but in passing by a spring, he had the leisure to have these verses of Saadi inscribed on its brink. I have heard that the exalted Jemshid inscribed on a stone beside a fountain, "Many a man like us has rested by this fountain and disappeared in the twinkling of an eye. Should we conquer the whole world by our manhood and strength, yet could we not carry it with us to the grave." Of another fountain he says, "I directed this fountain to be built round with stone, and formed a cistern. At the time when the Arguan flowers begin to blow, I do not know that any place in the world is to be compared to it." On its sides he engraved these verses: "Sweet is the return of the new year, sweet is the smiling spring, sweet is the juice of the mellow grape, sweeter far the voice of love." Strive, O Baber, to secure the joys of life, which, alas, once departed, never more return. From these flowers Baber and his army marched into the passes of the high mountains. His narrative goes on. It was at this time that I composed the following verses. There is no violence or injury of fortune that I have not experienced. This broken heart has endured them all. Alas, is there one left that I have not encountered? For about a week we continued pressing down the snow without being able to advance more than 2 or 3 miles. I myself assisted in trampling down the snow. Every step we sank up to the middle of the breast, but we still went on, trampling it down. As the strength of the person who went first was generally exhausted after he had advanced a few paces, he stood still while another took his place. The 10, 15, or 20 people who worked in trampling down the snow next succeeded in dragging on a horse without a rider. Drawing this horse aside, we brought on another, and in this way 10, 15, or 20 of us contrived to bring forward the horses of all our number. The rest of the troops, even our best men, advanced along the road that had been beaten for them, hanging their heads. This was no time for plaguing them or employing authority. Every man who possesses spirit or emulation hastens to such works of himself. Continuing to advance by a track which we beat in the snow in this manner, we reached a cave at the foot of the Zirin Pass. That day the storm of wind was dreadful. The snow fell in such quantities that we all expected to meet death together. The cave seemed to be small. I took a hoe and made for myself at the mouth of the cave a resting place about the size of a prayer carpet. I dug down in the snow as deep as my breast, and yet did not reach the ground. This hole afforded me some shelter from the wind, and I sat down in it. Some desired me to go into the cavern, but I would not go. I felt that for me to be in a warm dwelling, while my men were in the midst of snow and drift, for me to be within, enjoying sleep and ease, while my followers were in trouble and distress, would be inconsistent with what I owed them, and a deviation from that society in suffering which was their due. I continued, therefore, to sit in the drift. Ambition admits not of inaction. The world is his who exerts himself. In wisdom's eye every condition may find repose, save royalty alone. By leadership like this, the descendant of Tamerlane became the ruler of Kabul. He celebrates its charms in verse. Its verdure and flowers render Kabul in spring a heaven. But this kingdom was too small for a man of Baber's stamp. He used it as a stepping stone to the conquest of India, 1526. Return 100 thanks, O Baber, for the bounty of the merciful God has given you Sind, Hind, and numerous kingdoms. If, unable to stand the heat, you long for cold, you have only to recollect the frost and cold of Ghazni. In spite of these verses, Baber did not love India, and his monarchy was an exile to him. Let the last extract from his memoirs be a part of a letter written in 1529 to an old and trusted friend in Kabul. It is an outpouring of the griefs of his inmost heart to his friend. He says, "My solicitude to visit my western dominions, Kabul, is boundless and great beyond expression. I trust in Almighty Allah that the time is near at hand when everything will be completely settled in this country. As soon as matters are brought to that state, I shall, with the permission of Allah, set out for your quarters without a moment's delay. How is it possible that the delights of those lands should ever be erased from the heart? How is it possible to forget the delicious melons and grapes of that pleasant region? They very recently brought me a single muskmelon from Kabul. While cutting it up, I felt myself affected with a strong feeling of loneliness, and a sense of my exile from my native country, and I could not help shedding tears. He gives long instructions on the military and political matters to be attended to, and continues without a break: "At the southwest of Beste I formed a plantation of trees, and as the prospect from it was very fine, I called it Nazerga, the view. You must there plant some beautiful trees, and all around sow beautiful and sweet-smelling flowers and shrubs." And he goes straight on. Said Kazim will accompany the artillery. After more details of the government, he quotes fondly a little trivial incident of former days and friends, and says, "Do not think amiss of me for deviating into these fooleries. I conclude with every good wish." The Memoirs of Babur deserve a place beside the writings of the greatest of generals and conquerors. He is not unworthy to be classed with Caesar as a general and as a man of letters. His character was more human, more frank, more lovable, more ardent. His fellow in our Western world is not Caesar, but Henri IV of France and Navarre.